Hello, guys, this is Kay, and you're listening to Pod Rainbow Science. And in today's episode, I'm going to talk about minority stress and its relation to mental and physical health. Let's go. Hello, guys, once again. It's good to have you back. Thank you for joining me today. And as I promised the last time, today I'll be talking about minority stress. I'm gonna tell you what minority stress is, what it does to our body, what it does to our physical health, but also what it does to our mental health. But first, I'm gonna start with a quick update from my life. I had my first lectures on factorial analysis. It went pretty fine. I guess people didn't fall asleep, so it's my huge success. It was also quite a strange experience because the last time when I saw a student in real life was in June 2019, I guess. So it was some time ago, and I weaned myself off speaking to people in real life, not on Teams, not via Zoom. And those people seemed also very uncomfortable sitting in a classroom because you know how it looks participating in lectures during lockdown. People were sitting in their beds or eating in front of the screen, scrolling their Facebook, or I don't know, walking on treadmills while listening to lectures. And I did the same thing, so I know what I'm talking about. So I think we have to learn again how to cooperate with each other and how to actually be physically at the university, how to sit still for 2 hours or even more. Uh, Also, I don't want to be the prophet of doom, but I expect one more lockdown soon since the number of new cases of COVID is increasing. So I guess we're gonna have lectures at the university, like in the classroom for maybe month, maybe not even month. But we'll see. Anyway, I hope you are staying healthy and you're all good. And now we can jump right to our today's topic. Minority stress is a term that is often used in discussions about rainbow community, but is also often left unexplained or described only partially or superficially. So I'm gonna do my best to explain it simply, but completely and in the most comprehensive way I can. So let's start from the very beginning. It is well established true that straight people experience mental health adversities less often than lesbians, gays, bisexual, transgender people, gender diverse people, or any other person that doesn't meet the criteria for the so called common sexuality. And many years ago, researchers would say that it can be explained by just sexual identity or just by gender identity. So if we lived in 1960s or 1970s, when homosexuality was considered a mental disorder, we would probably be on the psychiatric ward, or if we were lucky enough, we would be treated by psychiatrists and psychologists who'd possibly try to change our sexuality to the normal state, which is being straight. Nowadays, we know that disparities in mental health, but also disparities in physical health, can be explained by something very different than just sexual or gender identity. Or to be more precise, gender or sexual identity they don't directly explain those differences. It's just a part of the story. There's something more than could explain those differences. And that something more is, surprise, surprise, social inequality. And since the social inequality is a very abstract notion and doesn't really tell us much about the phenomenon itself, there was a necessity to capture it in comprehensive theory that could help us explain what exactly is going on with gay people and straight people and how gender identity or sexual identity can explain worsened mental health among non-straight people. And in 2003, a guy named Ilian Mayer And I'm saying a guy, like, you know, I knew him for years and we're great friends. We're not friends. I don't know him actually. But Mayer is a huge, huge name in psychology. He's a great guy whose impact on LGBT psychology is profound. He came up with an idea that disparities in mental health between straight people and non straight people can be explained by a thing called minority stress. The whole idea wasn't really new. There were many research on issues such as internalized homophobia or the relation between gay-related violence and negative outcomes, but Elian Mayer just combined all those things together and described a theory that could explain this whole complex phenomenon. Mayer was especially interested in what factors influence on mental health of LGBTQ people, and he was even more interested in what factors can prevent LGBTQ people from experiencing mental health adversities. And what we as counselors, as psychotherapists, as psychologists, and as scientists, what we can do for LGBTQ community to alleviate the negative impact of social prejudice or rejection or discrimination and other negative events that LGBTQ people encounter on a daily basis. As Mayer himself stated in his first article on minority stress, he offered, I'm quoting, conceptual framework for understanding the excess in prevalence of disorder in terms of minority stress. The model describes stress processes including the experience of prejudice events, expectations of rejection, hiding and concealing, internalized homophobia, and ameliorative coping processes. So you see, we have prejudice events, such as, for instance, physical abuse in relation to being lesbian, gay, or bisexual person. We have expectations of rejection, sometimes also described as anticipated stigma. We also have concealing sexual identity, so that is pretending to be straight, for example, or omitting information about your relationship, uh, just to avoid people's suspicion that we might be gay. And it can, of course, take a variety of forms, from omitting using the name of your partner or using the like genderless form of describing your relationship, or even inviting a person of different sex to pretend you are in a straight relationship. And of course, all the other things that we do to hide homosexual or bisexual identity. We also have internalized homophobia, and internalized homophobia is itself a very complex phenomenon. So I'm going to start with an explanation of homophobia itself. Homophobia is, according to American Psychological Association, defined as dread or fear of gay men and lesbians associated with prejudice and anger toward them that leads to discrimination in such areas as employment, housing, or legal rights, and sometimes it leads to violence. And internalized homophobia can be described as both conscious and unconscious or subconscious to external negative attitudes toward people. So if you are a gay person or bisexual person or whatever non-heterosexual person, and you hear people, you observe society presenting negative attitudes toward LGBTQ people, and you see it from the very beginning. You see it almost from the moment you were born. You see the society being hostile, being prejudiced toward LGBT people. You see it during your formative years, during your adolescence, during your adulthood. Basically, you see it for your whole life. You hear people saying that homosexuality is a sin or homosexual people are sick. You hear things like, I'm not against homosexual people, but I don't want them to show off their affection on the street. Or I tolerate gay people, but not when they march through a city, or, other things like that. When you are constantly assaulted with such opinion and quotes, it is very easy to adopt this attitude towards yourself, even when you are a gay person. So, to put it in the easiest way, I would say that internalized homophobia is negative attitude toward yourself because you are gay or bisexual person. You devalue yourself, have lower self-esteem, You're convinced that you are a less valuable person because of your homosexuality or because of your bisexuality. And the final aspect of minority stress is ameliorative processes, which are the positive aspects of this theory. Those are all those things that alleviate the negative impact of prejudice, rejection, or discrimination, and so on. So, this would be, for example, social support from your significant other. Uh, and the minority stress, as you can see, consists of two types of stressors. Those two types are called distal stressors, and the second type are called proximal stressors. Distal stressors are located kind of outside a person, and those are all the events that are related to prejudice. So, like the distal stressors could be discrimination, it can be violence, it can be family rejection, it can be firing from work because of your sexuality. All the things which source is located outside of a person. And proximal stressors are all those things that are located kind of within a person. So the expectation of rejection is located inside you because it is you who expects the rejection. You anticipate the stigma, anticipate all the negative events that can occur. And concealment of your sexuality is also located within you because you are concealing your homosexuality or bisexuality. And finally, of course, internalized homophobia is the most internalized thing in this whole theory, and it is, of course, also located within a person. So we have proximal stressors and we have distal stressors. And there are three primary tenets of minority stress theory. First, minority status, being a part of a minority group, leads to increased exposure to distal stressors. So this one is pretty obvious. Being a minority person leads to greater exposure to violence, prejudice, and rejection. It's easy. The second tenet is that minority status leads to increased exposure to proximal stressors due to distal stressors. So you can see that distal stressors, such as prejudice or violent incidents, increase the intensity of proximal stressors. And to put it in a more comprehensive way, the more prejudice and the more negative experience you have in your life, the greater internalized homophobia you have, and you are also more likely to conceal your sexual identity, which is very logical because you want to protect yourself from next events, from another upcoming negative events. And if you hide your sexuality, you don't talk about your sexuality, you're not explicit about your sexuality, you have smaller chance of being a victim of sexually related violence. Those things are also directly related to the anticipated stigma, which is justified when you have previous experience of bullying and prejudice events. So we see it works like a vicious circle. We experience prejudice, we are afraid, we don't want to experience more prejudice and violence. We're not open about our sexuality. We live in the closets. Our level of internalized homophobia is rising, and when it's increasing, we expect even more prejudice, and so on and so on. And the problem is that this vicious circle isn't costless, and to be honest, the price is really high. And I don't want to brag a lot about distal stressors because it is quite obvious that prejudice and violence toward LGBTQ people causes PTSD and depression, anxiety, and most of all physical injuries among LGBTQ people. So it's kind of straightforward relationship. I want to focus more on those internal aspects of minority stress. And without a doubt, one of the most important issue, also the one that gained the greatest attention from scholars, is internalized homophobia. And internalized homophobia is linked to mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, social isolation, and emotional impairment. But it seems that internalized homophobia is also related to our relationship quality and even to our physical health. And I have to make a side note here. I mentioned before that minority stress is the whole theory, and each part of it, this theory is related to one another. Therefore, it is extremely challenging, if possible at all, to conduct research separately on internalized homophobia or separately on sexuality concealment and so on. Therefore, we as scientists try to measure or assess, for example, the influence of internalized homophobia while controlling the effect of concealment or controlling the effect of anticipated stigma. But we can never be 100% sure that the relationship is only between internalized homophobia and, for example, physical health. We can only say that it is possibly the effect of internalized homophobia, concealment, or any other factor, and we did our best to control other aspects that can interfere our research. But it's never, 100% influence we can measure. Okay, but coming back to the minority stress. Some people wonder how it is possible that homophobia, and I'm not saying violent behavior targeted to LGBTQ persons, but I'm saying homophobia like exclusion from social activities, rejecting human rights, or verbal abuse, how it can influence non-straight people's physical health. So here is the answer. Our bodies have natural ability to adapt to difficulties and stress, or so like stress reactions are absolutely natural elements of human nature. Reaction to stress, such as fast heartbeat, sweating, tightening of your muscles, increase of blood pressure, are all parts of the fight or flight reaction. And the fight or flight reaction is caused by chemical reactions in our bodies. It's controlled by the autonomic nervous system, and it is pretty common to many species, including humans. And from the evolutionary perspective, reaction to stress was super helpful when people were exposed to natural threats, such as wild animals, for instance. And nowadays, stress reaction also plays an important role. So that, for example, before exams, we can be more focused. When we participate in a road accident, we can we can do things immediately without unnecessary thinking. But when there is too much stress, or the stress is so overwhelming that it hinders our actions, here is a serious problem. And the same situation is with minority stress. When people experience short but intense amount of stress, it is motivating. But when people experience mediocre level of stress, but it's prolonged and lasts for weeks, months, or years, it stops being motivating and starts being fatal. Chemical reactions related to stress force our body to be alerted, and when such state lasts for a long time, and the corticosteroids, which are hormones related to stress, are being released constantly, our body and most of all our mind, they start being extremely tired. And the prolonged state of increased cortisol result with great risk of physical symptoms such as cardiovascular disease, increased blood pressure, low quality of sleep, slower muscle recovery, constant and increasing fatigue, headaches, or even diabetes. And cortisol also induces an increase in the expression of genes coding for the serotonin transporter, which leads to greater risk of depressive disorder. So this is more or less, in very simple words, explained the relationship between stress, the stress reaction, and further physical and mental problems. And I spent many years researching minority stress and each of its aspects. And what I know so far is that homophobia and social inequality is the problem not only for a person himself or herself, it is not a problem only for transgender or bisexual or gay people, but it is also a huge problem for society and by society, I mean the micro society, like family of this person, their partners, their parents, their brothers and sisters, but also for society in the global perspective. As you see, Minority stress is related to many health consequences, not only mental health, but also physical health adversities that LGBT community face over their lifetime. Uh, so, homophobia increases the costs, and by the cost, I mean literally money we have to spend on public health systems, such as treatment, therapies, surgeries, rehabs, or even shelters for homeless people. And I could multiply things infinitely. So, whenever you hear people saying homophobic things or transphobic things, and they are kind of immune to knowledge and reasonable arguments, and they, for some reason, don't realize how fucked up it is, just tell them it's not worth doing from the economic standpoint. Maybe this would be an argument that will change their mind, or at least sow the seed of reflection. And I believe this is gonna be all for today. I'd like to thank you for joining me, for listening to this episode. I hope you got something interesting. If you're not familiar with the minority stress, I hope what I helped you to understand it a little better. At least I did my best. And well, have a great week. And until next time, bye.